In the Bible, you may have read the patriarchs built several altars to God. A verse in Exodus 20 seems to state that Israel was permitted to make several altars, and God would manifest wherever one was built. But if interpreted correctly, this would contradict places like Deuteronomy 12, where it calls for one centralized place of sacrifice for Israel, which would have at first been the tabernacle, and later the temple in Jerusalem. So one passage seems to allow for multiple altars, but another says there can only be one. But what if both of these passages are not stating what we think, and they actually are consistent with each other? The scholar Benjamin Kilker has suggested the alleged contradiction between Exodus 20:24-26 and Deuteronomy 12 is imaginary. On his view, both are referring to the same idea, which is the sanctification of the place where God appears and distinguishing between holy and profane space. In the Bible, profane things belong to the world. It is where the common people live. But when God manifests in a place, he makes it sacred, and thereby separating it from the profane. Certain rules applied for entering sacred space, and rituals were undertaken before a priest could enter sacred space. When we look at the passages in question, we can see these ideas are implicit in the text. Exodus 20:24-26 states, "An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. And every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness not be exposed on it." However, in Deuteronomy 12 we read, "Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I am commanding you." As these verses read in English, they appear to contradict. The passage in Exodus seems to be stating that one can set up an altar to God wherever and perform sacrifices, and then he will manifest there. Whereas the passage from Deuteronomy seems to be stating that there can only be one place where God will manifest, and that is the only place that Israel can perform sacrifices. Because of this, many source critics have assigned the passage in Exodus to the E source, or non-P. It represents an earlier state of Israelite cultic practice, before the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. The hypothesized P source, in D, which is Deuteronomy, represent later traditions, as both advocate for a single place where God manifests his presence and sacrifices can be performed. Kilker suggests there is no contradiction, and both are actually teaching the same theological idea of distinguishing between sacred and profane spaces. First, the passage in Exodus is not necessarily a command for all of Israel, but based on the Hebrew grammar, can be interpreted as a command specifically for Moses in that situation, with God coming down to Mount Sinai and making it sacred space. Kilker notes the pronouns in Exodus 20 switch from plural and singular, suggesting a distinction is made between Moses and Israel. Israel is addressed in second person plural, whereas Moses is addressed in second person singular. So the text should be understood to mean, "And the Lord said to Moses, thus you, singular, shall say to the people of Israel, you, plural, have seen for yourselves that I have talked to you, plural, from heaven. You, plural, shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you, plural, make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth, you, singular, shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your, singular, burnt offerings, and your, singular, peace offerings, and your, singular, sheep and your oxen. In the whole place where I proclaim my name, I will come to you, singular, and bless you, singular." So when the text switches back to singular pronouns, it harkens back to the prior verses, where God is directly talking to Moses and telling Moses specific things to do. It is no longer a command for all of Israel, but only something Moses was commanded to do in this passage. Moses was instructed to make an altar at Mount Sinai to sacrifice at, because the mountain had become sacred space with God manifesting his presence there. And in fact, we see this take place shortly after in Exodus 24:4. So Moses seems to have understood that God was assigning a specific task for him. Kilker also notes the normal meaning of the phrase in Hebrew is not every place, but the whole place, and the grammatical usage is ambiguous in other places in the Hebrew Bible. It likely means for Moses to build an altar in the whole place, that being Mount Sinai. The whole place is meant to be understood as the whole mountain of Sinai, to emphasize that the whole place where the epiphany occurred is holy and must be separated from the commonplace of the people. The context suggests this, as the Israelites are not to approach the mountain, as it has become sacred, and they must remain in the profane space, while Moses was permitted to enter the sacred space. Even if the verse is meant to be interpreted as every place and not the whole place of Sinai, the verse does not state that God will manifest in every place an Israelite chooses to build an altar, but it specifically says that God will manifest where I cause my name to be remembered. The focus is on God choosing places, not the Israelites. Thus, in the context of the matrix of text that connects Sinai to the tabernacle, it is then best understood as a reference to a succession of places where God will appear in a cloud theophany. This interpretation is supported within the narrative itself by Numbers 9:15-23, where the word refers to the places where the cloud of the presence of Yahweh rests during the wandering in the wilderness. So Exodus 20 seems to be stating God will choose certain sacred spaces for Israel to sacrifice at, which is the same idea we encounter in texts assigned to P, where God manifests in the tabernacle as it moves from place to place, not wherever anyone builds an altar as they please within profane space. In fact, the passage in Exodus, which is assigned to non-P, or J and E, also has affinity with texts assigned to P. The text uses the term translated as place, but is also used in priestly texts for the sacred space of the tabernacle. Christoph Berner also acknowledges Exodus 20:26 has close similarities to Exodus 28:42-43, and the need to not expose one's nakedness when entering sacred space. So Exodus 20:26 could be understood in a priestly framework, with specifying ways to deal with covering one's nakedness and not exposing themselves before God. There is also an indication of God manifesting himself in the holy space of Exodus 20, only after the altar services have been performed, which is common in priestly literature. In other words, Moses is commanded to build an altar within the sacred space of Sinai, and then God will make his presence known. Similar to how the glory of God filled the tabernacle after altar services were performed. Thus, the principle of Exodus 20:24, namely that God will come to Moses, Israel, in the whole place, or succession of places, only on the condition that the altar service is performed outside, obviously remains valid for the tabernacle, as we clearly see in Numbers 9:15-23. So the text seems to not necessarily contradict priestly regulations and can function within a priestly framework. Exodus 20:24 may merely be about separating holy and profane space, not claiming Israel can set up altars wherever they please. Moses was commanded to build an altar to sacrifice to God at Sinai, which had become sacred space. Or it refers to God manifesting in every place of his choosing, since Israel was not to remain at Sinai, but move with the tabernacle. When it comes to Deuteronomy 12, it is often assumed the passage was meant to subvert Exodus 20:24 from the covenant code and mandate one single place of sacrifice. However, Hindi Najman argues, if one intends to replace an earlier code, why should one exert so much effort to incorporate and preserve its wording? Why should one constantly remind the reader of the earlier text, already accepted as authoritative, which one wishes to supplant? It seems clear that Deuteronomy 12 is aware of Exodus 20:24 and alludes to it by way of the covenant renewal of Exodus 34:12-13. Kilker suggests it's not necessarily subverting the covenant code of Exodus, but picking up on the same idea of distinguishing between profane and sacred space. Deuteronomy 12 refers back to many of the same teachings of the covenant code and its renewal, such as enlarging the borders of the territory, staying away from idols and pagan practices, and pilgrim festivals. Most importantly, Deuteronomy 12:13, when speaking of not sacrificing at any place, lacks a definite article. Many have argued this verse was meant to subvert Exodus 20:24 and rejects the idea of sacrifice at many places. But the construction of Deuteronomy 12:13 does not have the definite article, and so does not repeat the same phrase from Exodus 12:24 when it speaks of sacred spaces God makes his name known at. Instead, it uses the construction we find in Numbers 18:31, where it says the Levites are allowed to eat their part of the tithe at any place they desire, with the implication they cannot eat upon sacred space. In other words, it seems to be indicating the Levites can eat at any profane space, thereby making a reference to places that were not considered sacred, like the temple or tabernacle. Likewise, Deuteronomy 12:13 does not seem to be rejecting the Israelite cultic sites that were thought to be permitted by Exodus 20:24, because the author does not imply he thought Exodus 20 permitted multiple sites. Instead, the passage is in agreement with Exodus 20 that sacred spaces where God has caused his name to be made are proper places of worship over profane places in the Promised Land. Even Thomas Romer notes Deuteronomy 12 is concerned with practical consequences of the centralization law, and not on an explanation as to why it was a necessary law. Kilker suggests the reason is that when the verse says do not offer burnt offerings at any place that you see, it is not referring to and rejecting multiple cultic shrines for God, but rather saying to not sacrifice at profane places, and instead sacrifice at the places God has made his name known, like the temple or tabernacle. No justification is needed because it's not a subversion of the covenant code, but an application of Exodus 20 and 34. If God has caused his name to be made at a certain place, it has become sacred, and that is where sacrifices are to be performed. Thus, Deuteronomy 12 works with the concept as the holy territory. What is holy belongs to the holy place. Therefore, the holy offerings must be brought to the holy place, even from far away after the conquest. Holy sacrifices must not be slaughtered in just any place. Therefore, Deuteronomy 12:13-18 introduces a distinction between holy and profane slaughtering, based on the rules for profane slaughtering of wild animals, as found in Leviticus 17:13. The awareness that Exodus 20:24 speaks not about any place, but about the place, can be seen in Deuteronomy's subtle use of language by using the indefinite formulation, any place, for the profane places to avoid the definite formulation of Exodus 20:24. In conclusion, Exodus 20:24 is not claiming one can set up an altar wherever they please. It is insisting on altars at places that God has made his name known. Deuteronomy 12:13 is not saying there cannot be multiple sites, like Sinai and the tabernacle or the temple. It is a warning against sacrificing at profane places, and one can only sacrifice at an altar of sacred space. In reality, the texts do not seem to contradict or offer different beliefs concerning sacrificing to God. Thus, there is no need to claim this as evidence. The Pentateuch is a patchwork of different sources.